I've watched enough Peterson to really think that he's really, I think, there's something wrong. There's something wrong up there.
And it's always been the case.
Appreciate the call.
Yep. Have a good one, guys.
You too.
Let's do this Peterson clip that we have since he raised it, and we'll get back to the calls in a second. I watched Peterson interview RFK. God help me. I just came upon it, and it was actually sort of quite funny, where Kennedy had to sort of pretend he didn't pretend he didn't follow. He just sort of like a lot of things that Peterson said, Kennedy sort of just was able to pivot away from not taking responsibility for. I mean, I found it a little bit disappointing because, I mean, it's sort of fascinating. It's unclear to me exactly what Kennedy is doing these interviews, not reaching Democrats, but also not espousing any perspectives necessarily that would change the minds of a Peterson viewer. It's sort of interesting in that respect. But be that as it may, I found this segment of the interview. Maybe we'll talk about the rest of this interview later. But I found this fascinating because here is Peterson claiming that he goes and talks to Democrats. Maybe he does. Totally. It's fascinating. Like, listen to him talk about the threat that exists from Antifa. And just remember that, let's just for a moment assume, and we know this is not the case. I mean, you can Google this, very easy to find. The number of deaths that have taken place from right-wing extremists over the past, let's say, 20 years versus so-called left-wing extremists. These are just facts. But also, think about what the equivalent of Antifa is. Maybe it's the Proud Boys. Maybe it's those Oath Keepers. Maybe it's some other
white supremacists.
I mean specific organizations.
The fascist ones.
Yeah, the fasci ones. And think about their relationship, both of them, to power, to political power in this country. Keep that in the back of your mind. Like, how close was Donald Trump and all these advisors to the Oath Keepers and, the Proud Boys, just as an example, versus, I don't know, Biden and Antifa or Pelosi and Antifa. And then listen to what Jordan Peterson says here.
I think the data supports that quite clearly. But okay, so let me tell you two stories and tell me what you think about this. So when the Democrats I worked with in the US, in California, I had a conversation with them one day, very intelligent people, by the way, about Antifa. And they were on about QAnon and about right-wing radical groups. And they regarded them as entirely real and entirely credible threats. And that was partly as a consequence of the January 6th occurrences, let's say. And so I said, well, what do you guys think of Antifa? And they said, well, they don't really exist. And I thought, well, that's interesting because you think the right-wing conspirators exist, but you don't think the left-wing. But like I said, they're smart people.
Pause it for 1 second. I want everyone to take a moment, regardless of what your political ideology is, that are listening to this, and think about the names of the leaders of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. Just think about it for a moment. Now, tell us the leaders of Antifa.
Yep.
Okay, continue.
And there were also, I would say, credible links between high members up in the Trump or the Trump White House during January 6th and some of the groups that he's conflating. I mean, it's well documented.
But go ahead.
Wing conspirators exist, but you don't think the left wing. But like I said, they were smart people, so I investigated further, and they said, well, it has no centralized organization. It's not a formal group. It's a very small minority of people, and it's extremely loosely structured, and it isn't representative of even the radical left, much less the centrist Democrats. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So then I went and talked to Andy Ngo, who's a journalist who's covered Antifa in more detail than anyone else in the world, and who knows their organizational structure and their routines inside and out, and who's put his life on the line to cover this sort of this Antifa activity. And I asked him, how many Antifa cells do you think there are in the United States? And he said, well, there's probably about 20. And I said, well, how many full-time equivalent employees, so to speak, how many people do you think are in each cell that are dedicating themselves to the Antifa cause? And he said, well, maybe 40. And I said, oh, so that's 800 people. So that's 1 in 400,000. And, well, that's almost none. And so you could take that data and you could take the case, you could make the case the Democrats made, which is, well, the Antifa doesn't even exist. It's 1 in 400,000, you know. In a city of 1 million, there'd be 2 Antifa members who were full-fledged, you know, committed, full-time advocates.
Whatever that means.
But then you think, well, look at all the damage those people did. And then you think, well, maybe it only takes a trivial minority of people who are off the rails to cause a tremendous amount of damage. That's what happened when the Soviets took over the Russian society in the aftermath of the monarchies after World War I. It was a tiny percentage of people. And this is what made me worried on the Democrat side. So this is why when I went to Washington, I pushed the Democrats that I talked to. He said, well, when do you think the left goes too far? And so let me ask you that question, like fairly bluntly. You're trying to pull the Democrats to the center. You think it's a salvageable enterprise, and you think it's necessary to salvage it. It's a 2-party system. It's half the country. When do you think the left goes too far? And how would you, in your administration, draw a line between those who are reasonable?
Now, I can't even remember how Kennedy answers this question. He doesn't address the huge setup there. That was a 2 or 3 minute clip that we just played, 4 minute.
You can't even tell Kennedy's there.
And, well, no, he's in a different remote thing, and they have a weird way that they do this. But think about everything. Like, he's so close to understanding what the problem is. But imagine if that number wasn't 1 out of 400,000. Imagine if the people he was talking about were actually responsible for tens, if not hundreds, of people being killed. And imagine if that 1 out of 400,000, but it's actually a much larger number. I mean, we know this. The number of people in the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the One Percenters and the Michigan Militia and never mind, like sort of full-on white supremacist groups dwarfs those figures. Imagine if they not only existed in those numbers, which he says is terribly dangerous for society, like the Soviets did it that way.
Right, sure.
Imagine if they had direct relationship with the leader of the Republican Party.
Yep.
By every measure.
Roger Stone and Michael Flynn were in communication with these groups regularly as they tried to overthrow the government. The government, the direct, overthrow the democratic results of the election, at least. I mean, that's the reality of it. And we also shouldn't take Andy Ngo's numbers on face value.
Well, that's the high end.
But exactly. And this guy, Andy Ngo, is a far right lunatic. So the numbers definitely don't take them at face value, but they're also much smaller. When Peterson said that, I was like, oh, Ngo's going to come up with some absolutely insane figure. Still incredibly small. Even by that psycho's calculation, it's the other groups dwarf Antifa.
How can anyone who claims, like Peterson claims, to be some type of, scientist? I mean, he's, it's a soft science that he's doing. But how can anybody state a concern about that and not spend an hour and a half in his lead up to a question about what are you going to do about the radical right in this country?
Well, he's working with them, maybe. I mean, I don't really know.
Exactly. He's a right-wing propagandist. The bigger problem is this retconning of what the George Floyd moment meant, and that all those protests was radical Antifa. Those were normal Americans upset at police brutality. Newsweek, this is from June 3rd, 2020, 54% of Americans think burning down Minneapolis precinct was justified after George Floyd's death. Those were not all Antifa members. Those were regular American citizens.
And it's like, who's flying the 800 Antifa members all around the country in their private
And
jet to get there?
the Soviet comparison, what's the Antifa equivalent to Soviet? Which, to remind folks, were literally like, the translation is councils, like workers' councils getting together. There's no such thing as Antifa's council.
It's so crazy.
But they used Antifa during the George Floyd protests as a substitute because they didn't want to say anti-racism activists. They wanted to make it sound scarier. And we also know that there were like informants for the FBI. We know this for a fact, and other provocateurs making violence happen in some of those rallies, and it was still so minuscule compared to everything that we've seen, both from a statistical perspective on right-wing terrorism in this country, and from what we just saw on the isolated incident of January 6th, which Peterson's trying to compare it to there.
Right, that's a good point. I mentioned that Newsweek poll about the police precinct, but largely speaking, those for like the amount of people that participated in protest were extremely peaceful.
And honestly, I mean, we didn't even play what RFK said there, Sam, but I didn't even mean to mention Roger Stone and Michael Flynn in this context because he's being photographed with them right now.
Oh yeah,
he's being misled.
Formation.
I mean, I don't even want to remove his agency. I don't know him, but like, whoever's around him is doing something pretty insidious, and it smells like a rat F campaign or something that's like meant to, I don't know. It's not good vibes.
It's not good vibes.
No.
Calling from a 412 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?